David Marwell. Even after months of reckoning with the story, this book's title still has the power to induce a sense of bafflement. Consider it. An Auschwitz volunteer. Witold Pilecki was not forced into a cattle car and shuttled to the camp against his will. He chose to go. But Pilecki's story is not simply one of daring do or of a historical curiosity. It offers a chance to examine the plight of a Polish nationalist in the early years of the war, a figure squeezed both literally and figuratively from the right and from the left. It's a story that's been neglected in the West, and one with which Jewish scholars and institutions are really only beginning to reckon. To probe the question of the Polish plight and its myriad complexities, we're fortunate to be joined by a most distinguished panel. Timothy Snyder is the Bird White Hausum Professor of History at Yale and the author of 5 books, the most recent of which, his path-breaking Bloodlands, Europe Between Hitler and Stalin, was an international bestseller and has already been translated into some 20 languages. His reviews and essays can regularly be found in the New York Review of Books and other leading publications. Terry Tegnazian worked for 12 years in entertainment law before giving it up to found Aquila Polonica, a publishing company devoted to telling the story of Poland during World War II. Though the House has released just a few titles so far, they're off to an auspicious start. Writing in the New Republic a few weeks ago, the journalist Anne Applebaum said that the Auschwitz Volunteer deserves to be read alongside the accounts of Primo Levi and Elie Wiesel. David Marwell has been the director of the Museum of Jewish Heritage since the year 2000. Before coming here, he worked at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, and as Chief of Investigative Research for the Department of Justice's Office of Special Investigations, where he was responsible for conducting research in support of the prosecution of Nazi war criminals. Like Ms. Tegnazian, he is a recent recipient of the Knight's Cross of the Order of Merit of the Republic of Poland. While on the subject of things Polish, I'd like to take a moment to thank David Goldfarb and his colleagues at the Polish Cultural Institute of New York, our co-presenters tonight, for all their help in making this program a reality. It's my pleasure to say that the museum's public programs are made possible by a generous gift from Mrs. Lily Safra. And with that, please join me in welcoming to the stage Timothy Snyder, Terry Tegnazian, and David Marwell.
It'll be on when you need it. Good evening. Welcome to the museum, and welcome to what I hope will be a very interesting conversation. My goal this evening is to basically have a conversation between the 3 of us at the beginning, and then we'll ask you all to join in about 40 minutes toward the end of the evening and ask your questions. It is my guess that a vast majority of Americans and American Jews would be surprised that there were Polish prisoners at Auschwitz, let alone a volunteer prisoner like Witold Pilecki. To the extent that Poles were at Auschwitz at all, a surprising number of people would suppose that they were there as part of the guard detail, that they were victimizers and not victims. I have witnessed this fundamental ignorance of the history of Poland in World War II often. The book that we will discuss this evening offers a powerful corrective, in addition to being a fascinating, indeed thrilling story of courage and patriotism. By the time you leave the museum this evening, I hope you will have a firm understanding of this incredible story and how it came to be published. And I hope that we will be able to provide the necessary context to understand Pilecki's mission and his own story. I hope you will leave with an appreciation of who this remarkable man was. But even if we succeed in all that I have just outlined, you still must read this book. It has been written by some that this book is not a work of literature, having been hastily prepared as a report for his superiors, but how it is written and the insights that it contains leave a powerful impact that will reward the time you take to read it seriously and carefully. So I suggest, and I know that there will be copies of the book on sale in the lobby after this evening. First, I want to really make sure that we're all on the same piece of paper here. And I'm going to ask Professor Snyder, I'll call you Tim if that's okay, to give us the crucial context to understand Witold Pilecki and his mission. In other words, the story of what happened to Poland in World War II, at least at the beginning of World War II, of kind of 101 history.
Right. So the fundamental thing that we all have to remember is that in 1939, when the World War began, Poland was probably the most important Jewish country in the world. There were more Jews living in Łódź, which perhaps not all of you have even heard of, than were living in Palestine. Jewish culture in a place like Warsaw, where Jews made up a third of the population, was extraordinary. Yiddish was a major language in interwar Poland, as it was nowhere else in the world at the time. Jews were about 10% of the population. In the big cities, they were about a third of the population. Interwar Poland was a multinational country. Only about 2/3 of the population were Poles, the largest minority were Ukrainians, and then the Jews. This means that when Poland is destroyed in 1939 by an attack from the West, by the Wehrmacht, by the German army, and a simultaneous attack from the East by the Red Army, the Soviet army, you find this multinational country, Poles, Jews, and others, now under two forms simultaneously of imperialism. So someone like Witold Pilecki, who came from Eastern Poland, his friends, his colleagues, his fellow officers were being sent to the Soviet Gulag, or in some cases they would soon be executed at sites like Katyn. In what had been Western and Central Poland, a German occupation regime was putting Jews into ghettos and exterminating the Polish intelligentsia, the same kinds of educated people that, like Pilecki's friends, who were being persecuted on the Soviet side. There was a Polish resistance. The second important thing we have to remember, the first thing is that Poland was a multinational country that was destroyed by violence from two sides. Rather extraordinary thing. The second thing we have to know to understand Pilecki is that there was a Polish resistance. Poland was the first state that fought Nazi Germany. This is very important. Austria gave up, Czechoslovakia gave in. The Polish army fought. It fought for 6 weeks and was defeated. Many of its officers then went underground and formed an underground army, which came to be known as the Home Army. Pilecki was a member of this. So in order to understand Pilecki's mission, how one could volunteer for Auschwitz, one has to know Poland was destroyed, half of it is under German occupation, and the concentration camps that were established first in Poland were established to suppress Polish opposition. The first priority of the German occupation in Poland, the first priority in time, chronologically, is to destroy the Polish nation as such, that is, to prevent it from ever being able to create a state again, and to prevent any practical opposition. The way this was done was by creating, among other things, concentration camps. The one that we know best is Auschwitz. Auschwitz was established in the summer of 1940 as a way to prevent Polish opposition, to punish Polish opposition, to deter Polish opposition, to make it seem impossible. In the earliest transports in summer of 1940, some of Pilecki's friends disappeared. That's the context for his mission. His mission was essentially an espionage one, to find out what was happening in Auschwitz.
Tim, can I just ask you to talk a little bit about the territory of Poland? What happened to it in 1939?
So when we think of Auschwitz, we think of this place out of time. Auschwitz sounds like a black hole, something which is not of this earth. Before the Second World War, Auschwitz was a Polish city, a medium-sized Polish city called Oświęcim. It was also a military barracks. It was a Polish military base at Auschwitz. Incidentally, this Polish military base at Auschwitz was where Jan Karski was assigned at the beginning of the war, if that name means anything to you. Jan Karski was later the Polish emissary who brought the news of the Holocaust to London and Washington, and was, of course, widely ignored at the time. He, by chance, was deployed at Auschwitz when the war began. The disposition of Polish territory was a result of the resounding German victory and the resounding Soviet victory. In September of 1939, in August and September of 1939, the Germans and the Soviets agreed on the division of Poland, such that the western and the central part, including Auschwitz, the place that we know as Auschwitz, became part of a German colony, either part of the Reich itself or part of a colony known as the General Government, whereas eastern Poland was annexed by the Soviet Union.
Thank you. Well done. So let's get to the mission. What happened to Witold Pilecki? How did he end up in Auschwitz, and what were his motivations?
Do you want to talk about? I can. He volunteered to find out what was going on at Auschwitz. I think the Polish underground saw that the Germans had denuded the territory around this camp, and as Tim said, some of their colleagues were disappearing, and Pilecki volunteered for this undercover mission, and his job was basically twofold: to smuggle out intelligence as best he could, and to build a resistance organization among the prisoners. And what he did was walked into a street roundup. The Nazis used to just round people up off the streets, take them out of apartment buildings, out of houses. He walked into a street roundup and became a prisoner. And this book...
And when was this?
This was in September of 1940, so 3 months after Auschwitz had opened as a concentration camp.
This was the second transport?
My understanding is the second transport from Warsaw. Yeah.
And so he arrives at Auschwitz, and he describes his arrival there. Do you want to talk about that at all?
Well, I'm paraphrasing, but when he arrives at Auschwitz, and this is one of the more poetic moments in the book, he says, I've left behind everything that I'd known about the world and encountered something entirely new, which that's familiar as a description of Auschwitz, isn't it? I mean, we know that from other Jewish testimonies of the place. But then he sets, from that point forward, he then sets out to describe what the workings of the camp were like. Because for him, as opposed to the majority of Jews who entered Auschwitz, Auschwitz was an experience. He was there for almost 3 years. So he was in a position to describe not only how a camp like that could work, but how it changed over time. So it begins as a place where Poles are punished. And by the end of the war, something like 80,000 Poles are going to be killed there. That's the third largest group of victims at Auschwitz after Hungarian Jews and Polish Jews. It then becomes a place, to mention a victim group even more forgotten, where Soviet prisoners of war are killed. The first victims of Cyclone B at Auschwitz were Soviet prisoners of war. And then over the course of 1941 and 1942, it becomes an extermination facility for Jews. Pilecki sees this day by day and relates it day by day in this extraordinary report.
I mean, I think one of the things that when we first saw this manuscript, it actually was brought to us by our translator, Jarek Garliński, who was familiar with Pilecki because his father, Joseph Garliński, was a pretty well-known historian and author. He was Polish. Jarek's mother was British, and both his parents served in the Polish Underground Army during the war, his mother as well as his father. And his father was arrested and sent to Auschwitz. He was with Polish intelligence. And he knew that there was this resistance organization within the camp. So after the war, they emigrated to England, and his dad did his doctorate research for his doctorate thesis was on the resistance organization in Auschwitz, which later became a book called Fighting Auschwitz. And he went and found Pilecki's report as part of his primary source material. So when Jarek was researching something else at this archive in London, he came across the original report and read it for the first time in the original Polish and said, yes, this has to be translated. And so he translated it and brought it to us. But he did more than just translate it. He did the research to identify most of the more than 200 people who were named people and places for whom Pilecki used code numbers, code names. Because this was written in 1945 and these patriots were still subject to being arrested, tortured, executed by the communists.
Pilecki spends a lot of time talking about how the camp is organized, and much of it has to do with the other prisoners that he's imprisoned with. That the hierarchy of the camp that's important to him is not the German guards that are outside in the guard towers, but it's the hierarchy of prisoner, in this country we would call them trustees, capos, and camp leaders and other important prisoner functionaries. That I found very, very interesting. I thought also that he provided an insight into that organization that is difficult to find elsewhere with the kind of detail. Do you want to say something about that at all, the whole internal organization?
Well, so from Pilecki's point of view, Auschwitz is a punishment camp and a labor camp. He and others who are there as Poles are being punished, and they're also being exploited. But a camp is not like a machine. It's not like a robot. It's not something that functions on its own. It only functions because incentives are created that make the prisoners behave the way that they do. It would be very simple for us if we could just imagine that it was all some sort of machine or just a matter of a few evil guards. In fact, a camp, like any sociological situation, has its own structures which encourage people to behave in certain ways and not others. And at Auschwitz, as at all of these places, the number of guards, the number of people who work in the facility was relatively small. The thing has to more or less run itself. The interesting story, and it's a quite morally problematic story of the Polish resistance inside Auschwitz, is this. When the camp begins, all of the trusted prisoners are Germans. They're mostly German criminals who were brought into Auschwitz and can be relied upon to punish these Poles who were brought in next. But as time goes by, people like Pilecki, that is Polish political prisoners, are able to work their way into the more important camp positions. And that is precisely what allows them to be a resistance organization, right? You can't have a resistance organization inside Auschwitz if you're simply being punished and killed. You have to work your way into the positions involving the distribution of food, things like that, if you're going to be of any significance. So there are two stories in this book that are not very well known. One is the story of the sociology of camp life, and the other is of the emergence of the Polish resistance inside Auschwitz. The tricky part is that those are the same story.
How so?
Well, precisely, you can't, if you want to, so what were Pilecki and his fellow Polish conspirators doing inside Auschwitz? What were they counting on? Here comes the morally problematic part for Americans, if you like. What they were counting on was that at some point the Allies would bomb Auschwitz. Right? So this traditionally Jewish lament, right, of why was nothing done about Auschwitz? Why didn't we bomb Auschwitz? Why didn't the Allies think of Auschwitz as an important target? It's also his lament. He and the Polish conspirators are hoping that at some point the British and the Americans are going to bomb Auschwitz, and they're going to use that as their occasion to try to break out, destroy the camp, kill their guards, and so on. But that Allied strike, as we all know, never comes. In order to prepare for something like that, though, you have to make a close relationship with trusted people. And from Pilecki's point of view, these were other Poles, generally people with a military background. You have to get those people into crucial positions like the bakery. Right? The bakery is very, very important because
the hospital.
Kitchen, yeah, the hospital. Because if you're in the kitchen in the hospital, then your friends, your allies, are more likely to survive the camp. Right? That's indispensable. So these banal matters of organization are the same story as becoming the more important prisoners in the camp, which is the same story as resistance.
So how did he go about organizing this resistance beyond getting trusted colleagues in important positions? What was the goal of it essentially?
Well, I think he says that he started organizing on the same principle that they started organizing the underground army, the clandestine organization, which is the principle of cells. So he had cells of 5 people.
Which he called fives, right?
The fives. And sometimes they might have consisted of more or less than 5, 1 or 2 more or less. But he would start 5 people that he trusted. And one of those people certainly would know who he was. And then they went out and recruited their own groups. And he talks about, I think he had done 4 or 5 fives. He talks about starting those, and then how they spread out and how people would come to him. And actually, how successful he was is proved by the fact that the Germans never figured out that he was behind this organization. And even some of the other prisoners that that had been recruited would come to him and say, hey, there's somebody else recruiting, some other organization. And he says it was really his organization spreading out. But no one ever knew more than 5 people, so that no one could, if they were, and one of the other things he talks about, I mean, Tim talked about survival. That was his first, he says, what was going on in Auschwitz was I think they have one of the German, not the guard, but one of the head guys says to them when they arrive that if you live more than 6 weeks, we'll know you're stealing food. I mean, this is it. You're getting enough food and you're being worked outdoors in all weather with no clothes, no shoes, no socks. So he says, my first priority was to survive. And in order to survive, I had to get indoors. I had to get myself on an indoor work group. And I think he gets into the carpenter shop first, even though he knows nothing about carpentry. He said he learned very quickly, if you were asked what your job was in civilian life, to give a plebeian kind of workman job, never to say you were a judge or a lawyer or anybody in the intelligentsia, because those people were killed almost immediately. And in fact, his organization was broken many times because people were killed by the Germans, were tortured.
Once he recruited these people, what was the point of it? What did they do?
His first job was to survive, to build morale, to keep these guys' morale up, to get them a little extra food, to get them a little better jobs, to get them clothes. And then he talks about, at one point he mentions cryptically that they had a store of arms under one of the construction huts. So they were starting to collect arms. They, at one point, built a radio through clandestine pieces and did transmit out intelligence reports. But his ultimate goal was, as Tim said, to coordinate an Allied attack on Auschwitz, and he knew that they themselves, the prisoners themselves, were not strong enough to liberate Auschwitz, but in conjunction with, in coordination with, an attack from the outside, that he felt they could liberate the camp. And he sent out intelligence reports. He sent out reports requesting and begging his superiors and the Allies to attack. And you have to remember at this point, as Tim mentioned, Poland was the first country to oppose the Nazis. It was one of the Allies, and it fielded the 4th largest Allied force in Europe during World War II. Because not only did they have the home army within the country, but a fair number, several 100,000 soldiers and airmen had escaped Poland in September 1939, mostly going south through Romania, and found their way to France. They fought in France, and then escaped France when France fell, and fought in England. So they were part of the Allies. There was a government in exile in London, and they were appealing. Pilecki, through channels, was appealing for an attack on Auschwitz.
Yeah, there's something that we have to, when we ask about Pilecki's goals and his motivation, there's another level of this which we have to have in mind. All these things which Terry said and which I've said are true and important, that he was supposed to find out what happened in Auschwitz. He was supposed to send out reports, which he did. He was supposed to create an organization, which he did. He was supposed to plan for the contingency of an Allied attack. He did all these things. These things are important. But why did he do these things? And how could an individual possibly do these things? There's a level under all of this, which is the level of morality. Yes. When you read this, you realize that this is a highly morally motivated individual. And much of what he did in Auschwitz was possible, I think, because he thought that it was the only honorable way to behave, to use an old-fashioned word, which was very important to him. He thought that what he was doing was representing a kind of honor, human honor and Polish honor, that this is simply how one had to behave in this situation. And in that way, he made his experience in Auschwitz an extension of the kind of Polish history or Polish behavior which he would like to see reflected in general, which isn't to say that he idealized his fellow Poles. On the contrary, if you read the book from beginning to end, you see he's highly critical of his fellow Poles, highly critical of educated Poles who he thought were weak, highly critical of Polish political life in the interwar period, which he thought was incredibly divisive, highly critical of extreme Polish nationalism, highly critical of Polish communism at the end of the war. But nevertheless, what he thought he was doing was embodying some sort of ideal of how honorable people ought to behave.
I think in your review you say that he saw Auschwitz as a trial of the Polish nation.
Yes. I mean, he said that you didn't know who you... I mean, there's a Polish poet who eventually won the Nobel Prize, Wisława Szymborska, and her most famous line is probably, you know yourself insofar as you have been tested. Insofar as you have been tested. Pilecki says something very similar about his experience at Auschwitz. He says that you found out who someone was when you saw them inside Auschwitz.
Right.
So did he intend to remain there until there was a weapons drop or an attack from the Allies, or did he always intend to escape? It's unclear from the... I guess he becomes frustrated by lack of action and decides he needs to get out.
Well, you know, actually, David, I honestly don't think he knew what he's getting himself into when he volunteered for this mission. And I think the mettle of the man is shown by his ability to adapt and to survive.
You get a sense of this guy with a remarkable constitution beyond his physical courage, but he does spend a lot of time talking about how he's immune to stomach ailments, which are the plague for all of his colleagues there, that he never gets a headache, that he's able to eat.
Although he did get
typhus
a couple of times.
And you have some sense that that physical constitution was also expressive of his moral sense.
Absolutely, and one of the things that I found personally very moving, there was a couple of points in the book. First, fairly early on, where he said he felt overwhelmed by the situation, but he couldn't show it, because if he were to show it, how could he lead others? And that's, I thought, very powerful. And so whenever he was asked by his colleagues, well, how are you doing? He always said, I'm doing great. And he said, eventually, I came to believe it. He also talks about how having a mission helped him survive. It gave him a goal. There's another aspect to his heroism that really moved me, and that was the fact that in order to carry out his mission, he had to allow himself to be subjected to this brutal domination. In other words, you know, like the Polish pilots, they were heroes because, and they were able to act. And most heroes we think about, you know, with their guns and taking action against the enemy. He had to be submissive in order to carry out his mission.
That's very clearly presented when he's rounded up and they're waiting to be transported to Auschwitz. And he's in this big courtyard with a few hundred others.
No, he said like 1,800.
And he sees this large spotlight, and he already is developing a plan for escape, that he'll go to the bathroom and break the searchlight and organize
run out,
and he has to suppress those...
Because he says, my mission was more important. He had a more important goal. So that's an amazing... he was an amazing guy, and I think what Tim said is really true. He was extremely moral. I mean,
his concern for his comrades is clear throughout.
The other thing about his writing is it's very immediate, and this is something, the first time I read this manuscript, it is like he is sitting in the room telling you the story. And
so let's get back to the story. How did he get out of Auschwitz? And give us the details of this escape, which really sounds like a script for a major motion picture.
Well, I think what happened was, as Tim said earlier, the Auschwitz changed, and the nature of the camp changed, and there was a point in 1943 where the Germans started shipping some of the older Polish prisoners out to other camps, and so his organization was starting to fall apart, and he had to make the decision whether he had to figure out whether he wanted to get himself shipped somewhere else, which he really wasn't inclined to do, or stay and start to build a new organization with new people, which he also wasn't inclined to do. And finally, he really wanted to press the case for Allied intervention at Auschwitz personally. So he formulated this escape plan, and he told one of the other officers, he said, I'm planning to escape, and this officer said, this is a cute thing. Well, can one choose when to come to Auschwitz and when to escape? And he says, yes, one can. And as Tim said, because he had built this organization, he was able to do this. I don't know if you want to talk about the whole bakery thing. I don't want to monopolize.
Yeah, I mean, it probably, if you want the details of the bakery escape, you should read the
Yes.
book. But what's interesting about it is how much incredible amount of planning that went into it. I mean, the idea that you could just escape a concentration camp by a bit of daring do or a bit of luck is obviously absurd. He had to plan and plan and plan to get himself in the right place at the right time so there'd be even any chance of escape. And then there were a few moments of luck involved as well.
Yeah.
He escaped with a couple of other people. He took a bullet while he was escaping. So it was a very chancy thing.
How unusual was it to escape from Auschwitz? How many other escapes were there?
I think there might have been a couple of hundred over,
Yeah,
over the years.
It was in the hundreds. I mean, fewer and fewer as time went by.
And often they were captured, recaptured.
Yeah.
And
He makes a point in the book that the price of escape became less burdensome because
they changed the
initially
rules.
they had taken reprisals. There were reprisals for every escape, and by the time he escaped, there were no more reprisals within the camp.
Yes, originally the Germans would shoot 10 prisoners for every escapee. And as time went on, I guess they wanted to look better to the Red Cross and to some of the, because he talks about when other outside agencies would come to inspect the camp and how all the really poorly off prisoners were kept hidden, and only the prisoners who looked pretty good were shown to the
one of the
Red
things,
Cross.
Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, go ahead.
One of the things you see about Auschwitz as you read the discussion of the almost 3 years in the camp is how it became better organized over time. So in the beginning, there's an awful lot of killing in public. People die because they're exposed to the elements. They die because they're beaten to death in front of other people. They die because they're being killed as a demonstration. Over time, the camp sorts itself out into being a deadly but nevertheless fairly well organized work facility on one side and a killing facility on the other side. So the longer Pilecki is there, the more possible it is to get better work details, obviously in horrible conditions, but to do the kinds of things he did.
Conditions do improve for him over
Yeah,
time.
yeah, because over time, the idea is more and more with the Poles and other prisoners to exploit them. I mean, it's a matter of indifference whether they die or not, of course, but to exploit them, whereas the Jews who are coming in are being immediately killed in their overwhelming majority. For most Jews who come to Auschwitz, it's not actually a camp. From a Jewish point of view, after the spring of '42, camp is a kind of misnomer. Most of them are just being ramped off to Birkenau and being gassed. So it's a death facility rather than a camp. So in the beginning, Auschwitz is this kind of public killing ground where a lot of Poles are killed. I mean, 76,000 is not a small number. And they're killed in disorganized ways, and there are some Jews and some Jews are killed. By the end, there's a clear distinction where you have a camp, which is a deathly place, but nevertheless a camp, and this massive killing facility, which is the part we're more familiar with.
And he talks about the killing facility.
He does. He talks about how it was built. I mean, how some of the prisoners were used to construct the facilities at Birkenau.
Yeah. I mean, this is interesting, because even if all you care about is the Jewish history of Auschwitz, and I think if you care about Auschwitz, you should care about the whole thing, but even if all you cared about was the Jewish history of Auschwitz, Pilecki is there as the new gas facilities and crematoria are being constructed. He is there as Zyklon B is being tested on those Soviet prisoners of war. Zyklon B, of course, being the gas which is used to kill the Jews in Auschwitz. He's there when those tests are being performed for the first part. He writes about those things as they happened. So he witnesses things which are indispensable to know from the point of view of the Jewish history of Auschwitz. And of course, if anyone had, the crazy idea to deny the Jewish history of Auschwitz, here is a Polish witness of how the Jewish history of Auschwitz begins. And not only of how it begins, but he writes about the transports. He was on work details outside the camp, and he would see the transports of Jews come in, and he would witness, and he knew what was happening to them. He wrote about it very movingly. There are 3 or 4 very moving passages in this book, and one of them is precisely about the fate of the Jews.
Okay, can you bring us up to date with what happened to Pilecki after he left the camp?
Well, he escaped, made his way back to Warsaw, went back, of course, was part of the underground army headquarters in Warsaw, worked in intelligence. He was very active in trying to help prisoners and family of prisoners who were in Auschwitz, trying to get, again, the Allies to invade Auschwitz. He fought in the Warsaw Uprising of 1944.
Let's have some context for that.
Okay, we do that. Talk about that.
Okay, so we have to think of Pilecki the entire time as a Polish military officer, because that's how he thought of himself. The people who were in the Home Army, the Polish underground resistance, they didn't think of themselves as partisans. They thought of themselves as the legal continuation of the Polish army, which from the point of view of the Polish government in exile is exactly what they were. And by the way, from the point of view of the Allies, that is the Americans and the British, is exactly what they were. And Pilecki thought of himself as a military officer who was engaged in a special mission. So when he returns from that special mission, he continues to work as a military officer, quite right, finding other people who had been from Auschwitz. Incidentally, when he went into Auschwitz, he took someone else's identity, naturally, right? And the idea was that he took the identity of someone who had died. And it turned out that that person was actually still alive, and he ran into him
and this is another coincidence, an amazing coincidence, actually.
Yeah. But much more seriously, what he was then doing was taking part in the Polish resistance. Now, the Polish resistance was in a horrible position because, remember, the war starts with Poland being attacked from both the west and the east by the Germans and the Soviets. The war ends with the Soviets driving the Germans out of Poland. Right? That's how the Second World War ends. That's how we know it's going to be over when the Red Army reaches Berlin. How does the Red Army reach Berlin? It reaches Berlin by way of going through Poland, of course. Now, from the point of view of Washington or London, this is, of course, the victorious Allies surging ahead. But from the point of view of Poland, this is one of the powers that began the Second World War, now re-invading the country. Right? The Red Army enters Poland in 1939. It enters it again in 1944. And Poles have no reason to believe that their fate is going to be any different the second time around. And of course it's not. So if you're a Polish resistor, what do you do in this situation? What they banked on, and it's interesting because it's a little bit like what Pilecki was thinking about Auschwitz. What they banked on was a kind of fortunate coincidence. They thought, okay, at the very moment that the Soviets are driving the Germans out of Warsaw, we will have an uprising to demonstrate our will to resist and to demonstrate our sovereignty. It's the very thing, by the way, which the French resistance could stage in Paris. And I use the word stage advisedly. You could do it in Paris because only the Americans were coming, right? Only the Americans were coming, and they really were liberating you. In Warsaw, it was much harder to do. You carry out an uprising, but the Soviets are not coming to help you. They come and then they stop and they let the Germans suppress the uprising. So Pilecki took part in this uprising in the summer of 1944, which the Germans brutally put down, killing about 100,000 Polish civilians along the way. Afterwards, Pilecki goes into hiding, manages to escape the country, and then volunteers for another mission from Italy in July, I think it is, of 1945, with the remnants of a Polish army. He volunteers to go back into Poland to pass back intelligence about the emerging communist regime in Poland. He stays there for more than 2 years. He's arrested about 2 years after the time he goes in. He's arrested by the communist authorities, and he's show-tried, and he's executed as a spy. So one of the things that Pilecki's life demonstrates is that people who could be persecuted by the Germans could also be persecuted by the Soviets. And in this way, it's a very typically Polish story, or an East European story, really, and one which is very hard for us to process in the West.
I think one thing I'd like to just clarify is this is a different uprising than the ghetto uprising, which was in 1943. And people often confuse the two. There was the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in April of '43, and then a year and a half later, roughly, from August to October of '44, the Poles also, as Tim said, rose up against the Germans to try and liberate Warsaw before the Soviets took over the country.
So before we get to the audience, quickly about the book, when was this manuscript actually written?
The report, Pilecki, this is, the report was written in the summer of 1945. He wrote, he was sending out many small intelligence reports while he was in Auschwitz. When he escaped in April of '43, he did a brief report, something like 10 or 12 pages, and then a slightly longer report that was in April or June of '43. In the fall of '43, he did a slightly longer report, 20-some odd pages. And then before he went back into Poland for what became his final mission, he sat down and did this most comprehensive report. It's over 100 pages, single-space, typed on foolscap, which is like legal-size paper, with very small margins. And all the Polish things, the Polish diacriticals interlineated, so because this was typed on an American or English typewriter. And this report he gave to his superior officers, and it became part of the government records, and really, after the war, has sat in an archive in London for 70-odd years.
And how is it that we know about it today, and who knows about it, and when did they first learn about it?
I would say,
pedigree of this
as
story?
I started to explain, our translator, Jarek Garlinsky, knew about it because of his father, having found it and used it in his doctoral thesis. I believe obviously other academics know about it.
Is the name Witold Pilecki well known in Poland today?
Today it is, but for almost 50 years he was persona non grata. He was a spy, a traitor, viewed as a traitor during the communist era. And so only after the fall of communism in 1989 did his story start coming out, and he has now been totally rehabilitated, although he was executed in 1948 and his body dumped in a mass grave, and they're not even sure where. And so this summer, the Polish government has mounted a couple of exhumation projects to try and locate not just him, but also other Polish heroes who were killed by the communists. And they took DNA samples from his children to see if they could identify his remains. So he's pretty well known now. I know during the communist era, his wife and his daughter, I mean, his family suffered because he was a traitor. I believe they lost all their property, probably. I mean, were they enemies of the people? Is that what they called them during the era?
Well, their property ended up in the Soviet Union.
Well, that's true, too, so they lost it because of that. But they really, I think the family really suffered quite a bit, and it was very difficult for them. And so now, it's years and years later. His children are in their 70s or 80s. His wife has passed away.
If I could just add a footnote to that.
Please.
I mean, part of the drama of people like Pilecki, who resisted both the Germans and the Soviets, is that the Soviets, or the Polish communist regime, present them in this relentless propagandistic fashion as traitors, and as, if necessary, as anti-Semites. So there's a pattern of the Poles who behaved the most heroically during the war, precisely with respect to things like Auschwitz and the Jews, either being executed by the communists or serving long prison terms. So another example is Jan Karski, a name which is now more and more known, who the Soviets presented as an anti-Semite as a way to discredit him in the West. Another example is Władysław Bartoszewski, one of the Poles who was active in Żegota, which was the official Polish state organization charged to rescue Jews. He sat in prison for, I think it was 7 years, a very long time after the Second World War, because he had worked against Soviet as well as German power.
He became foreign minister.
Yeah, later on. Yeah, so when we say that these stories are complicated, I mean it's not just complicated for us to figure it out. It's that the people who wanted to preserve a sovereign Poland and who behaved the most generously to all of Poland's citizens, that is precisely the Jews, were very often the people who were then presented as the worst sorts of traitors after the war. And that's one more reason why they haven't come down to us in history, and why recovery efforts of this sort are important.
So as promised, I'm going to take the fourth wall up here and allow you guys in the audience to ask questions. And when I say ask questions, I mean ask questions. We're not here to listen to speeches, or I know there are a lot of interesting personal stories out there, but if you could really ask direct questions to one of the panelists, that would be great. We have a microphone over there. If you raise your hand, I'll try to see you. And we have 2 microphones. Anyone have a question for anyone up here? Let's wait for the microphone.
Yes, you mentioned at the beginning about the Home Army. You've talked about them, and maybe you could just explain a little bit how they, and I do know about them, I've read that they were highly anti-Semitic and that they were actually in some ways almost as bad as the Germans. I mean, they would either turn the Jews in or turn against them. And can you give a brief background on that aspect?
Sure. So the Home Army was the largest non-communist resistance organization in occupied Europe. in the history of resistance in Europe, we would like to think that it was a lot of attractive French women wearing scarves. There were two serious resistance organizations in occupied Europe. If you want to write a serious history of resistance to Nazi occupation, there are two things that count. And they're the same two things that count in Auschwitz, by the way: communism and Polish patriotism. The serious resistance movements in occupied Europe were Tito's partisans in Yugoslavia, and then Soviet partisans in Belarus and Ukraine. Communists, that's one. The other is Polish patriots, so the Home Army. And so if one cares at all about the history of who's resisting in numbers, those are the two groups you have to take into account. Now, one of the things which is interesting is that those two groups were inimical to each other, right? Polish patriots and communists are inimical to each other because communists want to govern Poland after the war, which is one of the reasons why the propaganda about precisely these issues is so ferocious. And in one of the interesting things about Pilecki's memoir is that he never writes about the communists, even though the communists had a very impressive organization in Auschwitz. Just to sort of close the circle, in Auschwitz there were two serious underground movements: one, Polish patriots, the other, communists, right? But they're not the same thing. And Pilecki writes the communists completely out of his story. Why? Because he thinks communism is a terrible mistake and it will bring great evil to his country. That's his view, and there's some logic to that view. Now, beginning to your question, so the Home Army is the continuator of the interwar Polish Army. It fights against the Germans under various names for the entire course of the war. Its record on the Jewish question is mixed, but the notion that the Home Army was something like the Germans or is no better than the Germans, that's absolute nonsense. I mean, for one thing, any force which fights on the Allied side, whether it's the Soviets, who also had a very mixed record with the Jews, has to first of all be given credit for that. So before we start talking about individual things, we have to say who are the Allies and who are not the Allies. And the Home Army was one of our allies. But the record with respect to the Home Army and the Jews, as I say, was certainly mixed. And Polish historiography on this is now catching up to the difficulty and the complexity of these issues. There were places where Jews were admitted into the Home Army and fought in the Home Army, and there were Jews who survived the Holocaust because they enlisted in the Home Army. There were a lot of Jews who fought in the Warsaw Uprising of 1944. So to say something which completely confuses both the Israeli and the Polish official history of the Second World War, there were more Jews fighting in the Polish Uprising of 1944 than in the Ghetto Uprising of 1943. Almost certainly, and a lot of them were in the Home Army. Some of them were in the Home Army openly as Jews. Some of them were in the Home Army as Poles of Jewish origin who do not see themselves as Jews, but who we might see as Jews. Some of them, most of them, were hiding their Jewish origins because it simply was not a good thing to be known to be as a Jew in those circumstances. So that's on the good side. On the bad side, there are very, very many cases of Home Army units who stole from Jews, who killed Jews as well. So the history of the Home Army is a mixed one. Just like, for example, the history of the Soviet partisans. There were Soviet partisan units which rescued Jews. There were Soviet partisan units that killed Jews. That's also a very, very mixed history. It's probably not surprising that in the context of a German occupation which murdered the huge majority of Jews, deprived them of property and standing, which forced the Jewish survivors themselves to turn to theft and living off the land, that partisan armies were not always friendly to Jews. And of course, there was a great deal of interwar Polish anti-Semitism. There was the belief that Jews were not part of the nation, especially after 1943, when the command structure of the Home Army changed. There was an unfortunate tendency to identify Jews as such with bandits in the countryside, and they were treated less sympathetically. So there's a very important history to be written here, but the most important thing is not to say they were just like the Germans. That's nonsense. It's also important to admit that people who belonged to the Home Army carried out terrible, terrible deeds against the Jews. That's also true.
Another question?
I have a question. You mentioned that at the beginning of his presence in the camp, they put together the radio and he was transmitting some reports. This story came to us from his account, or we know the proof of that actual? Who he was transmitting to? Who got those reports? Am I clear?
Yes, I know it from his report here. I haven't looked at whatever. See, I think a lot of the Home Army records didn't survive the communist coming through. I mean, some of them ended up in London. Some didn't survive. I don't know, Tim. Maybe you can answer.
I mean,
the radio. I mean, he testifies to that.
I was wondering about that too. I mean, the record, his written reports, we have, not just this one, but the earlier ones. We have them, or we have some of them. A lot of them have gone missing. Like most of the documentation from the Home Army, a lot of it was destroyed in the Warsaw Uprising, in which about 95% of the city of Warsaw was burned to the ground. That is, the part which wasn't the ghetto, which was already burned to the ground in 1943, was burned to the ground in 1944. The whole city, as a result of which, the documentary record is less than we might like for it to be. But we do have several of his reports, not just this one, but the earlier ones. I don't know if anyone has succeeded in finding the recipient's notes from the radio transmissions, but I see no particular reason to doubt it. But yeah, I mean, I was interested about how something like that could possibly be done in the conditions of Auschwitz.
Well, he talked about how he got himself on a work assignment in the radio room because they needed some help, or in the map room of where the radio stuff was happening, and they were, he and his organization were stealing tubes and doing whatever they could do, and then they assembled this somewhere where he said the Germans wouldn't go, and it was very opaque as to where that was. Yep. And then said they transmitted for about 7 months before one of their people gave or the Germans were constantly looking for the radio. They hadn't been able to find it, but eventually they dismantled it because they were afraid it would be found, or because someone had maybe spilled the beans on it, I think. Yeah. So they only transmitted for a short time, less than a year.
There's a question down here.
It seems that there was a wealth of information in the book, but apparently all of this was written after the fact from his memory, or he reconstructed a lot of this, because if he was transmitting piecemeal for a number of months, he had to have access to the recipient of this information. But there apparently, or it appears that there was a lot more information that he was sending out, or that he kept inside, or did he keep written notes while he was in Auschwitz? Where did all, not knowing, not having read the book, but apparently there's a lot of detail which was reconstructed after many years after the fact.
Well, it was 2 years after he had escaped. He wrote this report about 2 years after.
But he was in there.
He was in for almost 3 years. Yeah. That's right.
5 years worth.
That's right.
Some of it is 5 years.
So I think that's a good question, and I think he. You know.
He was a trained intelligence officer.
Oh, there you go.
I mean,
he had good memory.
There's a lot of this that you can't understand if you just think this was some guy who walked on the street and happened to. He was a trained intelligence officer. This is what he did. And that's what makes this more interesting in many ways than someone like Primo Levi or other people who got in and out of Auschwitz. This guy was trained to observe. That's what he was paid to do. In all likelihood, it's what he did in the interwar period as well. And it's the same ability which allows you to keep up all the transcript, all of the pseudonyms, the conspiratorial pseudonyms in your head during the actual conspiracy in the conditions of Auschwitz. Those same mental capacities are the ones that allow you to remember it later on. So just to give an example, which Terry has already mentioned, in the book, he writes exclusively with the conspiratorial pseudonyms of the people he's writing about, which he remembers. He remembers all of them. And the way that we know he remembers all of them is that the vast majority of them have since been decrypted and assigned to people on the basis of other historical sources. So, I mean, I take your point, but what I would say about it is that it applies much more to everything else we have about Auschwitz, because nobody was keeping a day-to-day diary in Auschwitz except for the commander. Right? The prisoners weren't doing things like that. It wasn't the kind of thing that you could do. This comes very, very close. I mean, in the review I wrote, I said this is somewhere between later literary and memorial recreations like Primo Levi and actual camp diaries, of which we have almost none. It's somewhere between there. But precisely because this guy was so involved in the organization of other prisoners, and which is mainly an intellectual activity, and precisely because he was a trained observer, an intelligence officer, I stress the point, he was pretty good at reconstructing things. So the book, when you read the book, what's interesting about it is that it's not, except in a few places which are very poignant, It's not a kind of literary creation. It doesn't have the move and flow of like Tadeusz Borowski or Primo Levi. It doesn't have neat chapter titles and so on. It doesn't have themes. It has an enormous amount of detail, and that's what's really most extraordinary about it.
Although I didn't come here with this question, your comments have led me to ask, can you describe the differences between how the communist group in Auschwitz versus the Home Army group in Auschwitz, did they have different goals, or was it similar? And how did they fare? I mean, did a lot of them survive the end of the war or not?
Okay, that's a big question.
Yeah.
So, let me try to answer it in a sort of general way. If you find yourself in a place like Auschwitz, your chances of survival are much better if there are people upon whom you can depend. Communists in most of Europe were coming from an underground because the Communist Party was illegal in most places in Europe. They were used to illegal organization. They were used to bounds of trust. And, Pilecki stresses trust over and over and over again, right? So communists came into the camps with habits of conspiracy, with trust in one another because of their deep ideological convictions, et cetera, et cetera. Those precise things which had marked them as outsiders in normal life were quite helpful inside the camps. For certain national conspirators like Pilecki, the same thing was true. He was used to a certain kind of clandestine activity, I'm pretty sure. He was able to trust his brother officers and certain people, certain other Poles as well. And he worked on that same foundation. In that sense, the way the organizations worked were fairly similar. You trusted some people and you didn't trust anybody else. And your goal, ruthlessly, was to keep your group alive through the end of the war. And the success of that, insofar as it was successful, strengthened the very bonds that you had at the beginning. So if you look at memoirs of camp survivors, you very often find people who say things like, the communists behaved the most beautifully inside the camps, but of course after the war everything was different, right? That sort of statement you find very often. How many of them survived? So let's remember we're now talking about the camps as opposed to the death facilities. If you were a Jewish communist and you got deported to Auschwitz as a Jew, you would be killed almost certainly. However, there were some paradoxical cases where earlier in the war, Jewish communists were arrested as communists and sent to camps, including Auschwitz, and survived because they had been classified as communists early on. How many such people there were, I wouldn't want to hazard a guess, but it's in the thousands.
Right at the front here, and then we'll take one question after that.
I have the impression that one of the earliest reports about Auschwitz was obtained from Rudolf Verba, if I'm pronouncing the name correctly, who was, I think, an escapee. About when and the timing of that report, which I understand caused quite a sensation because it detailed killing operations, was any of the information that Pilecki had transmitted out or one way or another precede that report?
Oh, well,
do you remember?
Well, let me take this. Let me take it broadly. Auschwitz was the later stages of the Holocaust, not the earlier stages. So, Auschwitz is a major killing facility of Jews from the spring of '42, but its major role in the Holocaust takes place in 1944, and it's mainly the Hungarian Jews who are being killed then. When it comes to reports about the Holocaust, those start much earlier. Those start in early 1942, before Auschwitz is all that significant in the Holocaust. So if your question has to do with when did people in London and Washington start hearing reports about the thing we now call the Holocaust, the answer is the spring of 1942, and it had to do with shooting operations in the occupied Soviet Union, and it had to do with Belzec and Sobibor, and then Treblinka in the summer of '42, facilities which were important much earlier in the history of the mass extermination of the Jews than Auschwitz was. So if your question is about when did we start hearing about those things, it was earlier. It was earlier than this, by rather a lot, earlier than Werba and earlier than Pilecki. If your question is, let's just compare Werba and Pilecki, Werba was a little bit earlier and was published and was widely known. This report, unfortunately, was written for his superiors. Yeah. It was meant to be a kind of, Pilecki was mainly concerned to have this bit, as he, I think, saw it, of the history of Poland. That's his primary concern, preserved for his superiors. I think that's the main thing he was trying to do. He wasn't writing for publication, and it hasn't been published until now.
Although he smuggled out his first reports from Auschwitz, he says, I think as early as November of 1940, which did not reach London until maybe March of 41.
Yeah.
So I don't remember. I know that Werba's reports were was important at Nuremberg. I don't remember the years.
Werba's escape was in the spring of 44. Though,
yeah.
right?
So it was later. I think he was later. I think he was later, but not later than this report. I mean, if I can put it.
Yeah, I mean, he's before this report, which was not published.
But still, Pilecki's reports were out earlier than that. He had been smuggling stuff out.
Yeah.
How did he smuggle them out?
I think various ways, as best he could. Sometimes prisoners were released. He would give little reports to them. When they would go out on work details, they had cooperation with the countryside, with the peasants in the countryside. I mean, the underground was operating pretty well. There was a civilian forced labor camp that I think he talked about at one point when they were looking for the radio, was it? They were tearing up the civilian forced labor camp, which was different than the actual Auschwitz, which was, I guess there were prisoners in Auschwitz. This civilian forced labor camp, there's another German name for it, starts with a G, I forgot. But they weren't really prisoners, but they still kind of were.
The other thing to remember is that at the beginning, Poles were serving sentences in Auschwitz.
Supposedly.
So they got out.
And so you could literally be sentenced to 6 months at Auschwitz and then be released.
If you
and
survived.
Your fellow if you were alive, and your fellow prisoners knew of your release date. And so if you were part of this, if you were part of the conspiracy and courageous enough, you might try to sneak a message out.
Also, family members could buy their family people out of Auschwitz. I mean, I guess they bribed the Germans. I don't, you know.
Let's have one final question. You've had your hand up for a long time.
I remember reading somewhere that the idea of extermination camp came from the Germans using camps with extermination facilities where they sent those individuals, Germans, who they thought were inferior, like mentally retarded or physically deformed. And that's kind of where that started. And that they sort of mentally accepted that as sort of a euthanasia kind of thinking. And that kind of thinking and those facilities carried over to the Holocaust against the Jews. That, the Jews were an inferior race, and this was kind of a euthanasia.
So do you have a question?
And yeah, I wanted to know, does he see any kind of, when you said that there was a change in the camp, is there, some kind of thinking along these lines? And also I heard that the Germans were just afraid that, if they didn't exterminate the Jews, that the Jews would obviously turn against them and be a source of strength with the Allies at the end of the war. But getting back to the question is, does he relate any kind of change, along those lines?
Okay. Let me try to answer your question in a broad way and in a narrow way, because the question you're asking in a way is, how did the Holocaust happen? And this is a question I tried to address in my book, Bloodlands. It's a question which many people have debated for a very long time. The point that you make about euthanasia is, I think, a technical one. rather than a causal one. The way the Holocaust proceeds in time, and I'm now going to give a timeline which might seem a little unfamiliar because it includes all of the victims, but the way the Holocaust proceeds in time is that when the Germans betray their Soviet allies and invade the Soviet Union in June of 1941, then they begin to kill Jews. They begin to shoot Jews in large numbers then. By the fall of 1941, they're shooting whole Jewish communities. Some of these sites are known: Babi Yar, Kamieniec-Podilski, the Rumbala Forest. The mass industrial murder of European Jewry begins with shooting, and it begins in the occupied Soviet Union. By the end of 1941, about 1 million Jews have already been murdered, almost all of them by shooting. The shift to gassing is a change of technique rather than a change of goal. Hitler's goal, and again I'm simplifying a very complicated story, but Hitler's goal from the beginning is always to eliminate all Jews wherever German power reaches. This begins with shooting, and the shooting continues throughout the war. And by the end of the war, almost half of the Jews who will be killed in the Holocaust will be shot. But between 1941 and 1942, a new technique is added. And here's where what you say is correct. There is a technique of asphyxiation by carbon monoxide, which was developed as a matter of German, what they thought of as German racial hygiene, and used on people they regarded as handicapped. That technique and those technicians, the same people, were brought to Sobibor and to Belzec and to Treblinka, and that technique was then applied to Jews in those three facilities. But I would stress that it was a technique. Whether Jews were shot or whether Jews were gassed, it's all part of the Holocaust, and it's all part of this general Hitlerian and German aspiration to eliminate all Jews under German control. Now you ask about what Pilecki can see. Obviously from his perspective inside the barracks, he's not privy to all the sources that we have now. He can only talk about what happens inside the walls of the camp. But what he relates is a qualitative change. First, Polish prisoners of war being beaten to death publicly, then they're being killed by phenol injections. Then you have experimentation on Soviet prisoners of war, the second major victim group in the camp. They're the ones who were first killed by Zeklonbe. And then, beginning in 1942, you have this new situation where Jews are being brought in very large numbers, and they're being killed, down to the last man, woman, and child in some cases. And although he can't tell us why this is happening, right, from his point of view, he does make a very clear distinction. I'd like to just read one passage of what Pilecki says about this. He writes, "Over 1,000 a day," he's writing of the Jews, "over 1,000 a day from the new transports," he's talking about 42, "over 1,000 a day from the new transports were gassed. The corpses were burned in the new crematoria." And then he reflects, "When marching along the gray road towards the tannery in a column raising clouds of dust, one saw the beautiful red light of the dawn shining on the white flowers in the orchards and on the trees by the roadside. Or on the return journey to Auschwitz, we would encounter young couples out walking, breathing in the beauty of springtime, or women peacefully pushing their children in prams. Then the thought uncomfortably bouncing around one's brain would arise, swirling around, stubbornly seeking some resolution to this insoluble question: were we all people?"
So I think that will be our last word this evening, except for my word of thanks to the panel and to all of you. Thank you very much. Thanks for coming.
I'm going to go to